Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Misguided the Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and today's guest is Dr. Claire Wardle. Dr. Wardle is a professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University and a leading expert on misinformation, media literacy, and public trust in science. Over the past 2 decades, she's trained journalists around the world, worked with organizations like the UN and the BBC, and she co-founded the nonprofit First Draft and the Information Futures Lab at Brown University. In our conversation, we talk about the challenges of labeling misinformation, how institutions can better communicate during times of uncertainty, the emotional and social reasons why people share content online, and how we can reimagine public communication to better connect with people. I read and cited Dr. Wardle's work many times, and I was excited to chat with her today. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. I wanted to ask you about your background because you've had a diverse career that spans both academia and working with different media companies. So can you share more about that journey of how you got into studying media literacy and misinformation today?
Yeah, I actually quite like telling my students this story because I think they have all of this anxiety about having to choose the career when they graduate. And I didn't think I was going to do a PhD. I came over to the States to do a master's in political science and ended up in a pretty heavily theoretical department. And I was like, oh no, this is not what I want to do. And I ended up taking classes in a communication department that was all about persuasion. It was all about media. And I was like, oh, this is fun. So I ended up staying and doing a PhD. And then came back to the UK to have a job as a professor. And I thought, oh, I've spent years studying. Now I'm going to be a professor. This is what I do. And whilst it was a great place, I just sort of felt like things that I was writing, nobody was reading other than my mum. And I felt really disconnected, even though the things I was studying were really relevant. And it was about things like crime coverage and trying to come up with ways to improve crime coverage, and I was like, but it's not reaching anybody. So around that time, I was doing new research for the BBC on user-generated content in 2007. And the BBC was saying, we're getting all of this stuff from the audience via text message and email, and we don't know what's true. So I got into this space basically almost 20 years ago through this question of how do you verify what's true from social media if you're a newsroom. And I wrote a report for them thinking that I'd just move on. And they were like, actually, we work with you for 6 months? Come to the BBC for 6 months and help us implement these findings. And I was like, what? That's not how it goes. And within the first 2 weeks, I was having all these amazing conversations with journalists who were really reflexive and wanted help thinking through stuff. And I was like, this is it. I am, inspired and excited. And so then I got asked to do 50 days of training for the BBC. So much to my mother's horror, I left my nice, safe job with the pension and ended up training journalists. And I got to travel the world training journalists on how do you verify social media. Anyway, long story short, I then worked for the UN for a year, worked for a startup in Dublin for a year, was doing different things, had my own consultancy. And then in 2015, came back to the States to work at Columbia University in the journalism school. And then from there, co-founded a nonprofit called First Draft that was all about misinformation. And then it's only recently, the last 3 years, that I've come back to the academy. We can talk about that. It's partly because I always felt increasingly vulnerable doing this work, being alone and not having a big legal department and other things. And it just became harder to fundraise. And so now I'm back in the academy, but some people have called me a boundary spanner. I really like to think about bringing the best of the academy to the practice world. But I also think practitioners doing amazing things every day, they're just not necessarily evaluating it. So we don't necessarily know what to scale. So I'm just a real proponent of how can we work across these things. And who knows how long I'll stay in the academy. But yeah, I like a change. I think that's what I've learned about myself.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's great to be able to take those backgrounds and perspectives together and help you inform your future work, but also just like get out of those silos. So often academia, we can stay in our own academic bubbles and even within academia, you just stay within your own discipline sometimes and not even, traverse into the, private sector necessarily. You have the silo within a silo too.
No, exactly. Yeah. And that's, I think, as much as people talk about interdisciplinarity, the reality is that doesn't happen very much. And my frustration is, sometimes I'll go to academic conferences and I see people giving these papers and they're talking about how journalists should improve their work or how civil society should improve their work. And I often put my hand up at the back and said, if there was a journalist in the room right now, they would have a whole host of things to say to you. It's very safe to say this as an academic when you're not actually engaging with the communities that you're talking about or researching. There's a ton of people who study journalism studies who've never set foot in a newsroom. So to me, it's how can we particularly in the social sciences, if we're going to talk about real world impact, how can we ensure that we're actually doing that and not, sitting in ivory towers thinking that we've got all the answers, because we have not.
Yeah, that's certainly true. It kind of reminds me of when I was a grad student, we were learning how to evaluate research papers and grants and stuff like that. And when I was studying cognitive neuroscience, we were taking this very experimental focused class where we had a lot of like experimental psychologists and neuroscientist students. And I remember we reviewed this paper and this grant from a clinician and a clinical psychologist. And a lot of the experimental psychologists and neuroscientists were saying like, oh, this has so many flaws and issues, and why didn't they control for all these things? And then when the person came and talked about their process of why they had to do it the way they did, it was very eye-opening. We're like, oh, it's actually much more complicated than the lab where you can control for everything. So
exactly, yeah.
Like you have to have these conversations, yeah.
And it's always trade-offs, right? And no discipline has got all the answers, and no practitioner has got all the answers. It really is about working together. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen enough. And a lot of this is incentive structures. But I think in the world that you and I spend time in, I was just at a conference on Friday, actually, and it was about information integrity. And I said to the room, I said, this is probably, I've gone to over 500 of these types of conferences. And until today, I'd never been at a conference when anybody from the community was around the table. And there were some high school students, English as a second language, who'd done some research on AI. And I was like, what does it take and to have the community in the room to be part of these discussions? Like, it just so rarely happens. So yeah, I feel I get pretty head up about it, because I think it's critical that we bring people together who are actually impacted by technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I definitely want to ask you about. So yeah, before we get into the social media companies and, bringing users to the table, which I think is absolutely important, I want to kind of take a step back and think about the term misinformation, since this is something that we both have written about and spoken about. And just the term itself, misinformation, has become politicized and polarized, as you know, and I know you've written about. And I'm curious if you could speak more about the term itself, your concerns about the term and how it's used today, and then how can we better frame these challenges about information more broadly and the information environment that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, so back in, end of 2016, early 2017, was when the term fake news really became popular. And it had existed before academics had written about the term, but it was very much a term that was used to describe actual websites designed to look like news sites, right? That was, when we said fake news, that's what we meant. And then in January 2017, for the first time, Trump basically stood up in a press conference and called Jim Acosta from CNN and said, you're fake news. And so it was this term that was being used increasingly as a descriptor, but I felt like it was not describing the problem. Like, a lot of the stuff that people were using the term to describe was not fake. A lot of it is genuine, but used out of context. A lot of it doesn't even try to look like news. It's memes and videos and satire. And I was like, hang on, that doesn't really make sense. So later that year, I worked with a colleague to come up with a report called Information Disorder, which was an attempt to say, can we stop using the term fake news? And within that, we defined, it was already out there, misinformation and disinformation. And we coined the term malinformation, trying to be clever, trying to be like, we just need more sophisticated terms. And in the last couple of years, I've really reflected on, I know why we were trying to do that. We were trying to get people to say, listen, sometimes this is intentionally created. That's disinformation. Sometimes it's not intentionally created. That's misinformation. And those kind of definitions look nice on a PowerPoint slide. They look nice in an academic article. And it was an attempt to simplify what at the time felt pretty confusing. But I think what I recognize and reflect on now is that what that term doesn't do is actually get at the complexity that continues to exist. So in the same way as fake news as a term was weaponized, misinformation has been weaponized because the term itself fails to capture the complexity, right? So what we saw during the pandemic was information that was labeled misinformation, but it wasn't misinformation in the sense that had been defined before. It was unsettled science.
Right.
We labeled things as misinformation if people said, I'm not going to take the vaccine because I don't believe it's a silver bullet. I don't believe that if I take the vaccine, it'll prevent me from getting COVID. At the beginning, that's what we were told. We were told, take the vaccine so you won't get it. Or we were told asymptomatic people won't pass on the virus, right? That wasn't intentional disinformation, but it also wasn't mistakenly sharing that disinformation as misinformation. It was the reality of a moment where the brand new virus could not be, we didn't have enough research. So the problem was we labeled things as misinformation and we were wrong. There's not enough people apologizing. Like, I'll put my hand up. Like, was leading First Draft at the time. We wrote things and labeled things as misinformation, which we shouldn't have done. And by doing that, we lost trust in people who were like, hang on, that is actually good information. So why are you labeling it as that? So unfortunately, we sort of lost touch with that idea. And there was a sense that people are lying to you. And so unfortunately, these terms have been weaponized in the same way now people label content moderation as censorship. And I think there is a lesson for many of us who think about these issues that trying to come up with simple terms actually can sometimes backfire, because ultimately, if we don't really lean into the complexity of a situation, these terms can be weaponized and used against us. And I think sometimes we're a bit naive, like, we've come up with a new term, we've come up with a new Venn diagram, we've come up with a new typology, without thinking like, well, what are we missing? How could this be misused against us? What are the unintended consequences? And I think language is one of those ways that we have failed by not recognizing how, by failing to properly describe what we mean, these terms that have seemed benign have actually been weaponized against us, and so undermined the work that has been done by good people trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, COVID was such a salient case study like that, like you mentioned. And I think there was this motivation to create certainty and say something is true versus something is false. But as you just mentioned, like with this evolving nature of the new virus that we discovered and found ourselves in, the evidence was changing. Like, it was the best available evidence was constantly changing as we're getting more data points and understanding how things unfolded. So there was a lot of lessons to be learned in how to communicate during times of scientific uncertainty that impact a lot of people at once. And I think that some public officials and public health officials realized that and admitted faults, which is nice to see that kind of growth. But unfortunately, we also see the falling out of trust in science more broadly. And this idea that, being so quick to label things as misinformation can be counterproductive.
Yeah.
So when you think about the information space, how do you think it's best to categorize it, both from like an academic sense? You mentioned like these terms that make sense for academic papers, but when you're just like communicating to people not in academia, not reading these papers, how do you describe false or misleading information online, for example? Like, how do you categorize that?
Yeah, so I tend to try and use descriptive words, like you just said that. Like, I'll often say false or misleading information that's been deliberately created by people trying to make money. Right. Like, so I'll try and bring the reason why people are doing it, which often gets ignored. There's a lot of focus on like, what's the content? Is it true or false? As opposed to, well, this is somebody who's created a ton of ads. They're being targeted at people like us because there's a perception that we're going to buy these supplements, which haven't been tested. But the reason that people are trying to undermine trust in vaccines right now is because they're trying to sell us these supplements. Right? So in many ways, I think what I'll talk about conspiracies and say, conspiracies are when people are looking for answers and they don't have a clear answer. And so, there's this idea that there's a secret plot to control things. Like, that's a conspiracy. Or I'll call out a lie, or I'll say it's a rumor because people aren't sure and they're talking to one another, trying to figure it out. Like, they're trying to figure out whether it's true or not. Like, that's a rumor. So I think we have a lot of terms that we can use. And I think sometimes by relying on certain terms, particularly as academics, we don't actually describe what's happening. So we don't help people understand a moment, or, to this point of like, is it an outright lie by somebody who's trying to gain power by deliberately just saying something that's false? Or is it like, well, they seem to be saying something that's false. It's not clear whether they really believe it or not. So I think the complexity gets lost when, if you can use a sentence, you can do more to help describe what the motivation is of somebody doing it and what the potential impact or harm might be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I continue to grapple with and try to best learn how to best communicate. Sometimes I still use the term misinformation, and I try to use it as like a starting point for basically describing everything we're talking about now. It's like, okay, academics have used this term, they've used it incorrectly or maybe too often, and try to open up a conversation about what credible information looks like and how we can kind of dive into the sources of misleading content or false content. And then even a broader discussion of like psychological bias and how we have this motivation to process information in a way that affirms our identities and our communities and things like that. So I still try to use the term sometimes if I think it could be productive, but it's definitely something I'm mindful of.
Yeah, but I love what you're saying there about a starting point, because I think there's this idea that I know best. And I'll often say to people who I see are struggling or sharing information that I potentially am worried about, and I say, look, I'm really struggle with this too. like I teach this stuff, but it's really hard. Like I'll go for a Google search and I have a Gemini overview at the top and I'm trying to figure out whether or not that's true or not. And then I'm going to different sources and I don't know all the sources. And sometimes on the front page of Google, I get contradictory information. Like I think the more that we all admit that this is hard, right? There isn't this like one ground truth that you can like, well, if you go and check that site, it's always going to be true, right? So I think that's acknowledging that and admitting how hard it is that we're so lucky to have all of this information at our fingertips. But now it really does feel much more difficult to know how to find good information and how to double check and how it's a journey. And, in that process of lateral reading, like I'm almost never doing one Google search, getting one answer and saying, thanks very much. That all of us that do this work is always about cross-checking and, making sure that different types of sources from different types of background are saying similar things. But that's labor intensive, it's time intensive. Right. And acknowledging that and not being like, oh, you're stupid for sharing something that's not true. That I think there's so much about the ways in which academics and journalists have framed people who are sharing misinformation, for want of a better word, without recognizing why people are doing it and why it provides certainty or why it actually provides answers, because otherwise trusted sources aren't answering their questions. Like a lot of my work now is less about the bad stuff. It's more about the absence of good information from universities or journalists, or, like lots of people have really valid questions. And when you go looking for the answers, it's really hard to find. And I often say, conspiracy theorists are really good at search engine optimization. Universities are terrible. Like, can we acknowledge the failures actually of, those of us who do have access to good information, our failure to write in a clear way, to make it visual, to put it in spaces where people are spending time, to act in a way that people would trust us. There's been huge failings, right? And it's very easy to blame the platform algorithms. And yes, that's true. But I also think there needs to be a reflection on the role of those people who could have done a better job of communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there definitely is a lot that universities and institutions can learn from. And I think now that they've been under attack, now, unfortunately, comes to the point where they feel like they realize that maybe they should have put more resources in communication and messaging. And it's unfortunate it comes to this point where there's this dire straits of being under threat that they actually seem to have a motivation to change. And it speaks to the incentive structures that previously there wasn't a lot of incentives to be public or share your knowledge with a broad audience if you're an academic. And sometimes you'd be even penalized. It's like, why are you wasting time doing that and not, writing another paper? But now we see there is a lot of utility to sharing your knowledge and explaining why what you do is important to the broader public who are not in academia or don't know a bunch of professors. So I think it's nice to see that there's been some change, but I think we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, and I could not agree more. And because it's also a different set of skills. Academics are trained to write thousands of words. Academics love text, love PDFs. Right. The idea of getting onto TikTok and creating a visual story or talking to camera or using language that is it has some emotion to it or authenticity. I mean, that makes most academics come out in hives. Like the idea that you would talk in that way. But that is absolutely what we've got to change, because there's this asymmetry around different information environments. And so, if you spend a lot of time on TikTok and Instagram, it's very, very visual. It's very emotive, or, you have emotions when you respond to it. A lot of it is based on experience, not expertise gained from lots of different degrees, And so then when you compare to, on the kind of trusted side, it's like, well, put a person behind a podium that's got lots of letters after their names, publish a PDF that nobody can find on Google. We can't keep living in this asymmetrical world. So when I do see doctors or nurses or professors doing an amazing job on TikTok, I'm like, yes, please. But it is a different skill set that, you don't get trained in this at grad school. Like, here's how you can create a compelling TikTok, because to your point, that is how you get tenure, right? And until that changes, there's no incentive for people to do that, even though I would argue that why are you an academic if you're not trying to make the world a better place? That's an aside.
Yeah, no, I definitely share that with you. So I guess kind of to tease this out a little bit more, what can we do to change those incentive structures? Like, what can academics do, or people listening to this? Is there anything that we can, like practical steps to put pressure on universities to change their incentive structure? Is there even anything in place that can?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to talk about this moment that universities are in. Partly when the news came a couple of months ago that the overheads from federal grants would go from kind of, 62% to 15%, and academics were up in arms, and lots of people that aren't in academia were like, what do you mean 62%? That's crazy. Yeah. And so much of it was because there'd been a failure to talk about how federal money had helped develop whether, all the different ways that science that had been developed from universities had helped people and their communities, right? And that to me is such a failing. So I do ultimately think that universities are going to have to say, if we're going to survive, right? I'm at Cornell, like it's an amazing place, right, in upstate New York, really in rural communities. There's a whole host of things that Cornell does to help its local communities. Does it communicate that as well? I mean, it has the Cornell Chronicle that tells some stories. Most of it is text-based. Like, does Cornell have a TikTok channel? No. What would it look like for universities to really tell that story? And that would also mean that in the same way as when you go up for tenure, it's how many peer-reviewed journals do you have, but how many, how much impact have you had? And it doesn't mean that you have to have millions of followers on TikTok, but show me when maybe you have a podcast, maybe you're a board member of a local newspaper that you help shape. Maybe you're doing a class with local people where you're sharing skills and you're developing communication. Like, what does it look like to completely rip up the rule book and say, yeah, peer-reviewed articles are important, but they're only one part of what it means to be an academic in 2025, right? It's not, we can joke about ivory towers, it's not enough because you can have people attack. And if you don't have communities saying that's unfair, if you have communities being like, well, I don't know what it does anyway. Like we have a big university, I don't know what it does. Like, who are we blaming here? Right? Are we blaming the president? Are we blaming the communities, or are we blaming ourselves? And I do think that this has to be, like, just after COVID, a reflection on where are our communication failings. And this as a communicator, right? Nobody ever funds communication.
Right.
When you think about the vaccine, millions and millions of dollars spent on developing that vaccine, rolling it out, getting it to every CVS, all of that. How much money on the communications part? Like 1%. You talk to anybody that was involved in that, it's like they never considered that people wouldn't just be standing in line for hours to get a vaccine. They couldn't imagine, right? And so they didn't invest in communication.
Yeah, that was pretty shocking to read. I mean, I guess I'm in this space and I think about communication and social science a lot. And then to see, all that money spent on the vaccine, and there was like no thought about how do we actually communicate the importance of the vaccine. And people have admitted this after the fact. It's like, oh, we actually should have invested just a little bit of money in thinking about how to communicate it.
Yeah. And I'm working on a project right now, actually, around the rollout of the malaria. There's a new malaria vaccine coming to Cameroon and other countries in Africa. And the same thing is happening. All this money is being spent on developing the new malaria vaccine, but vaccine hesitancy is higher than before because of COVID. And we're looking around being like, there's already loads of rumors spreading around what the malaria vaccine will do, what it won't do. And it's like, how do you get ahead of that? Because otherwise they'll be like, well, we've got the vaccine. Why isn't nobody taking it? And then it's all about blaming people as opposed to, well, we didn't think through how this might be read by people. We didn't do the necessary preparation work. We didn't invest in communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's a lot of reasons why people share misleading or false information as far as the failures of institutions themselves. And I want to talk about, to shift gears a little bit, about other reasons why people share content online. And I know you've written about this and I've written about this before, about how so many people share content to connect with other people and express identities. And I was wondering how we can shift the conversation away from viewing people as this like misinformed group of people and thinking about the ways in which why they might share the information that they do, and how researchers and journalists and institutions can think about this in a way that can engage them more productively.
Yeah, I mean, I often in my classes will talk about a time where I shared misinformation, which was at the beginning of the pandemic, where I was getting a text message saying New York City was going to shut down. And I shared it with 5 friends in New York City. And an hour later, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm the woman who teaches this stuff, right? But it was because I was scared. And I think if there was more of an acknowledgement of how information fills different emotional needs, and whether it's if you're scared, you want certainty, or whether you're feeling lonely and you want connection, like I think when you really reflect on the reason that we go back to social media every day and keep scrolling, like what is it about it that drives us to that? And it's all about the feelings that feed gives us on whatever platform. And everybody knows that, but for the good stuff, but I don't think people are very good at thinking about that for the bad stuff. And I just wish there were more high profile people who are like, I see stuff on Blue Sky all the time. I don't reshare it because I'm like, I really don't know if that's true or not. I haven't got time to check, but that made me laugh, or that made me feel smug, or that made me think, yeah, I knew I was right all along. Like, I think we just have to acknowledge that, like it fills something. But the question is whether or not you go on to share it and all the checks that you need to do. But yeah, I think just if we could just shift to why it is that we're glued to our phones. Yes, they are designed with addictive affordances. Yes, that's true. But like the content itself, what is it doing? Whether it's the puppy, I just watched a video of a puppy eating a hamburger in record time, and I loved it. Like, I loved it, right? Was it true? Was it AI generated? I don't really care, because it just made me feel something.
Right.
Over lunch when I was trying to procrastinate from my emails, right? Like, I just wish we could talk a little bit more about that, as opposed to high quality, low quality information. It's like, it's doing different things. It's not just about informing us. It's doing all these other things. And I think academics and journalists, like, we're so focused on, is it good quality information, making sure that people are informed so that they can navigate a democracy. It's like, well, sometimes a really funny hamburger eating dog is also doing something important. And can we just acknowledge that and not be snotty about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly a goal that I have, is try to acknowledge the full range of why we go online and try to connect with other people, and, seek out whatever kind of content we seek out, and try to acknowledge the human part of that and the human needs that range from connecting with other people, or just, finding something funny, or just any kind of reason why we consume the information that we do.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's top of mind because I just gave a lecture about it this morning, but we were talking about parasocial relationships and AI chatbots. And what's so fascinating to me is when you look at transcripts, when people are having pretty deep conversations with these bots, and you look at the way that bots respond to people, no wonder people are falling in love with them. No wonder people are using them as therapists, right? Because we can scream till we're blue in the face about the AI companies and all the things that they're doing, and how they've stolen all of our work, and all the issues around content moderation and not paying people, and all the stuff. Like, acknowledge all of that. But when you actually look at the way that bots talk to people, they absolutely understand that it's about feelings. They absolutely understand it's about emotion. They absolutely understand what empathy looks like. Like, it's stunning to me when you look at these transcripts of absolutely how they get it, and how you would put like a white-coated scientist in that situation, or you'd put most journalists, or even most researchers. They would not be able to have that kind of conversation with another person. But as somebody who studies the bad side of the internet, I can't help but look at that and be like, oh my goodness, people are going to get manipulated you put the dark forces with these AI bots, and it gets pretty scary pretty quickly, because they absolutely understand that emotion part that those of us with access to trusted information just don't.
Yeah, it definitely reveals this psychological needs that many people have, and they're not being met. That social needs, loneliness, mental health issues. And, I think about that whenever I interact with comments online, and seeing like why people have this motivation to post something that's maybe more inflammatory, like they might feel lonely or feel a need to connect with other people, or just, have people pay attention to them. And then you have these chatbots that can fulfill that need. So instead of like trolling people and getting attention, you can just talk to your chatbot and yell at them, or, say whatever you want, and it will respond, like we said, like with empathy and thoughtfulness.
Yeah. Yeah. It will be polite. It doesn't get mad at you. It doesn't ghost you. It doesn't, it doesn't scold you. It's like, I'm sorry that you're feeling that way right now.
Yeah, I know. And a lot of times people just want someone to say that, just like that simple 100%. Acknowledgement of feeling.
Yeah.
So given that, you kind of touched on some of the issues with these social media platforms, I know it's a big question of like, what role do you think tech platforms should play in reshaping our information ecosystems, because it goes into so many issues. But I was wondering if you could think about like, what can tech platforms do in a practical sense? Like, where have they fallen short as far as addressing our species, basically? And then, what are some practical steps that we can try to put pressure on them to make our information ecosystem a bit of a healthier place?
Yeah, I mean, the platforms make me so frustrated, because it's not as if misinformation was invented in 2016, but that's when people started really thinking about it, studying it. Money was floating around. But I think at that point, platforms would turn up at conferences and they would say that they were listening and they were going to do something. And I think many of us really believed that there was things that they could do and they were going to do it. We've known over the last 8 years, there's lots of research now on the more friction you build into a system, the more speed bumps, essentially, warning comes up, or a flag comes up, or something just says, hey, maybe you want to think about this before you share it. Or, like you have to click to uncover, any of those things. We know from all of the research that's some of the most effective ways of slowing down misinformation. It's not changing your mind, but it's just making it, I can't be bothered, right? And so what that actually does, it's about stopping the distribution. And so if these platforms weren't every quarter having to make more profit than the previous quarter, I think they would be doing this, right? If these were public interest platforms funded by, like the PBS or BBC's version of a social network, if we'd really invested in 2008 in public interest social networks, they would do that, right? There would be reasons to kind of create safer spaces. But because these platforms are incentivized by profit to such a degree, not just like, oh, it'd be nice if you made money. Like, no, you have to make more money than the last quarter. They are never going to do that. And then Elon Musk taking over kind of provided this like other platforms this ability to like, what? You don't have to have really big trust and safety teams. What? You don't have to have fact checkers. Oh my goodness. Okay. Right. So in the last 2 years, all this work that has been done has been completely dismantled in a way that I find absolutely horrifying. Maybe Brussels and the Digital Services Act, maybe regulators from Brussels might be able to put pressure on, but I doubtful. And we're seeing, American tech titans with Trump saying, don't you dare try and do anything with us. So I think the truth is, for people like you and I, Matthew, like it's got to be about working with communities. It's got to be about, helping people recognize the ways in which platforms are designed to trigger our emotions, why they're designed to be addictive, why they're designed to make us more likely to share low quality content. Because I don't think, unless there's a shift to public interest social networks, I think Blue Sky is interesting as a place that's trying to come up with content moderation decisions that are absolutely about creating a healthy community. Then maybe there's some hope there. I mean, maybe there is a lower tolerance now for, we've seen people leave X because they don't want to be on a platform that has almost no content moderation. So maybe users will vote with their feet, or maybe we will continue to have a hyper splintered platform ecosystem. And so if you want low levels of content moderation, you go to Rumble or BitChute or Parler or Gab, or X. If you want more moderation, you go to Blue Sky, and so maybe that's what it looks like in the future, and you kind of choose your own adventure. But if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, I'd have been like, yeah, I think the platforms are really moving in the right direction. And now I do not have any hope, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's going to be both. We're going to see more of a splintering and fracturing of communities. And some are going to be bigger than others because surveys have shown that people like some kind of content moderation overall. Like the majority of people don't want to go on just a chaotic platform with lots of terrible speech thrown at them all the time and harassment and stuff like that. I think giving users control of what they see would be a nice start. So yeah, Blue Sky seems to do a good job with that, with giving users tools to have the algorithm that they want and see the content they want to see. Of course, that just also makes this further splintering of people seeing more and more niche content that affirms their identities. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
As far as how that goes. I guess to get to your other point about engaging with communities, I know you've done some work focusing on like more community outreach and building resilience in different communities. I wondered if you could just speak more about that and what that will look like in the future too.
Yeah, I mean, in particular in America, I mean, civil society is so strong, and as we know, more and more people are turning to other people they know to get information. So for me, it's a no-brainer to support communities so they have access to good information that they can then translate that literally into other languages, or they can translate it into language that their community uses. They can use place names or images or, names that make sense for their communities. So, whether it's around vaccine information or electoral information, so much of it is partnering with communities that are really strong locally, trusted. And, I've done a ton of trainings with people and said, look, you then have these conversations with your communities in ways that make sense. Like, don't parachute me in and be like, listen to this nice lady with a PhD. Like, that's absolutely the wrong way to go. So much of this is also training communities to listen, to hear what people are concerned about. When I was at Brown University, the School of Public Health, at the Information Futures Lab, we did a project in South Florida with Spanish-speaking diaspora communities where we identified 25 what we called information navigators. And some of them were, a librarian or a journalist, but some of them were like the school crossing lady or somebody who had a construction company and had, 10 immigrants working with him. There was a whole host of people, but they were trusted by what they described as their community. And they listed all sorts of different communities. And every Sunday we would send them a quick survey on WhatsApp, which said, what questions do your community have this week? What concerns do they have? And what rumors are they hearing that they're worried about? And then on the Monday, we'd get this spreadsheet of all of these things. And then we would like create content and send it back via WhatsApp so that people could either share it in their groups or have conversations with each other. But the takeaway for me was, I think only 19% of over 600 responses were rumors. The majority were questions and concerns that people had. Like people are just like, I don't know, do I need to have a shingles vaccine? Or why does it keep raining in Florida right now? Or like, should I buy a gun? I mean, it was like, it's such a mixture of questions and concerns, some of them very practical, some of them existential. But when you actually ask, what questions and concerns do you have? And often I'd see it and I'm like, oh, that's easy. We'll just Google it. And it was really, really hard to find an answer. And it was really hard to find an answer in Spanish. And I was like, here we go. We're so focused on false and misleading information, but we're actually really bad at just ensuring that people have good information in the language that they speak coming from somebody that they trust. Like that to me is like, how can we spend more time doing that? Because I do think it's the absence of good information that actually makes people more vulnerable to low quality information because they're searching, can't find it. And then you have a question like, I've got a 9-year-old son. Should I get them vaccinated? I'm worried about myocarditis. What do we know about it? Is it connected to the vaccine? And the CDC's like, oh, we don't know. We don't need research. We're not going to say anything. But the conspiracy theories are like, yes, I'll tell you, myocarditis, right. Your son is absolutely going to get that. Don't get vaccinated, right? So how much of this can we blame the conspiracy theorists and how much can we blame the absence of information as opposed to, we are concerned, we're currently working on this, we will have an answer to you in 10 days, whatever it is. Like it's never easy when you don't have good research yet, but saying, watch out for people who are telling you with any certainty, because actually nobody knows yet, right? We should be better at calling out when there is an absence of information rather than just silence, because you can't be silent in the year of 2025 because those vacuums get filled.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like some institutions and academics would address uncertainty with silence instead of just saying that they're uncertain and they're working on it. And, there's some work looking at this, but that if you ask people to evaluate how much they trust different statements from officials, and those who embrace uncertainty more tend to be viewed as more trustworthy. I think there's definitely a lot of lessons to be learned there. Even though people want certainty, I think more than that, they want to follow someone who they deem as trustworthy and is on the ground figuring stuff out for them. And there's this absence of both good information and trusted messengers of that good information. So trying to think how we can get more people to take time to communicate, what they've been studying with a broader group of people, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And that gets back to, we talked about visual content. The thing about influencers on TikTok or whatever we want to call them is they appear honest. They appear,
right.
There's that sense of, oh, they're just like me and they're having a bad day or, and the question to your point, like how can we make trusted communications much more like that? Like, we know this right now. We don't know that. Follow me. I promise you, I'll give you the best information when I have it, because it affects my family too. Like, how can we get people to talk in those ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think slowly people are realizing that it's okay to be more authentic and less conservative and safe.
Yeah.
As it becomes more of like a social norm and we see other people do it. I mean, we're such social creatures too, like within our bubbles. If we see other academics, be more human online, then other academics like, oh, it's safe for me to do that. I can say something that's... So I hope that it can just be this process of changing these social norms of people in these spaces where they say, oh, this person, they're a successful academic and they're being themselves and admitting when they don't know stuff online and showing a human side of them. So now it's more safe for me to do that too. So I hope that continues to happen, but that's really the only...
Yeah, that's a really good point. But we're seeing that right now with universities. Harvard came out with a statement yesterday, and you're seeing many other universities follow suit. So it's like social norms for large institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess it does require some people to, make that first step. And even if they, don't do it perfectly or the best at all times, I think what matters more is making an effort to try, and then more people will see that. And hopefully, we'll end up having a net positive on our information ecosystems.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for joining me. I really enjoyed talking with you today, and I'm sure my listeners will find this conversation very, very informative.
I hope so. It was lovely chatting.